Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel of perspectives on priorities, power, and evidence for food systems transformation. My name is Bhavani Shankar. I'm from the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom, and I'm part of the Imana Management Group. And I'm basically here to introduce the session and hand over to the chair. But some housekeeping first. Please note that the session will be recorded, and the recording will be available on the ANH Academy website after it finishes. All participants have been muted, but please do introduce yourselves via the chat function. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and what institution you're from. Later on in the session, we'll have a chance to have questions and answers in a separate period of time. But we do encourage participants who want to ask questions to keep those questions coming using the question and answer facility, the Q&A facility, rather than the chat. Please do keep that in mind. So moving on, 2021 is a really important year for food, nutrition, and health. It's an important year to be taking stock calendar-wise, because we are, if you think about it, midway through the United Nations Decade of Action on Nutrition. And we have exactly 10 years to reach the SDGs. I know it sounds crazy, but we have 10 years left. 2021 is also a big year because of the various summits that are happening. There's, of course, the UN Food Systems Summit that's going to be coming up in September. There's the climate conference, the COP26, that's going to be happening in the UK in November. And then there's the Nutrition for Growth event in Tokyo that's going to be happening in December. And of course, food systems transformation is going to be right center stage in all of these summits. So ANH Academy has been engaging with all these issues with these summits, and notably through the co-organizing a UN Food Systems Summit dialogue along with the African Nutrition Society and the CGIAR, basically talking about the research needs and the research capacity needs in Africa to build the evidence base to guide that food systems transformation that needs to happen. But while the Academy has been engaging with the summit, it's also been listening to the voices that have been speaking up about issues like corporate dominance, issues like equity in participation at the summit. And the Academy, with its big tent ethos, essentially wants to continue discussing these aspects, make sure that everyone has a say about it, and hence the session today. So introducing our chair for today's session, we are very pleased to have with us and very lucky to have with us Tin Le Nguyen. Tin is a journalist and correspondent with a special focus on food systems and climate change. And she's been covering and writing a lot about this topic recently. And if you Google her name, you'll see lots of articles about this issue that will come up. All excellent stuff. So prior to working independently, which she does now, she worked for Thomson Reuters. So without further ado, Tin Le Nguyen.
Thanks so much, Bhavani, for the housekeeping notes and the introduction. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're logging in from. My name is Tin, and I'm going to be the chair for this session, like Bhavani said. And also, just to repeat Bhavani again, this, of course, is a big year for food systems, with major summits that's going to be tackling these interconnected issues around food, nutrition, climate, and biodiversity. And like Bhavani said, this includes the first ever food systems summit that the UN Secretary General is going to be convening in late September. The aim here, of course, is to transform the way we are currently producing and consuming food. The thing is, pretty much everyone I've spoken to agrees that we need a food systems summit. Global hunger levels have been rising for at least 3 years in a row now. Now, the latest data also showed that food systems account for about 1/3 of man-made greenhouse gas emissions that are heating up the planet. And multiple reports have also cited agriculture as a main culprit for biodiversity loss. Now, what people can't seem to agree on is how that transformation is going to come about and who gets to have a say in the how. Now, I'm sure many of you have seen and heard the debates around the summit. A lot of the grassroots organizations feel that issues around food sovereignty and rights have been ignored, and that they worry there is a corporate capture of the summit, that big businesses are driving the agenda. Now, the summit secretariat has said that they welcome and want to hear from everyone, and that the summit 5 main work streams are led by farmers, civil society, academics, researchers, government representatives, and youth organizations. In other words, not agribusinesses. Now, I want to make this clear. This panel discussion isn't about criticizing the summit. It is to look into the deep-seated issues that the summit has raised, because these debates reflect the wider discussions around food and agriculture in general. Food is a very emotional topic, I think, for many of us. It is so tightly linked to our cultures, traditions, and histories, as well as our own personal memories and beliefs. And while we can choose not to drive a car or own a smartphone, we can't choose not to eat. If we're lucky, we get to eat 3 times a day. If we're even luckier, we get to choose what we eat. So food touches every single one of us. And it is literally, and I feel justified in using the word here, literally the difference between life and death. So today we are going to be looking at the broad themes around food systems transformation and where the research community fits in. And we have a stellar lineup of speakers to make sense of all these knotty issues for us. Now I'm going to introduce the speakers in alphabetical order. We have Alan Dangor, who is Professor in Food and Nutrition for Global Health and the Director of the Center on Climate Change and Planetary Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Next, we have Chemuku Wikesa, researcher and practitioner of indigenous food systems and biocultural heritage territories at the Kenya Forestry Research Institute. We also have Hilal Alva, former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, and she's also currently a research professor at UC Santa Barbara. Last, but definitely not the least, we have Raj Patel, research professor and author at the University of Texas in Austin, whose movie called The Ants and the Grasshopper is also just out. So how this is going to work is that I'm going to ask a few round of questions to our speakers, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Like Bhavani said, please use the Q&A box to send your questions. And it would also be great if you could identify yourself and your organization. Now, I'm going to start with a question to all of our speakers, and I'd like them to take no more than a minute or two to answer this particular question. Food systems transformation is a buzzword and everyone's talking about it, but what exactly does that mean to you? Maybe we'll start with Hilal. I think you're still on mute, Hilal? Great.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, you're right. It's a transformation is a buzzword and indicates the necessity of the change. Many of the food policy discussions start with this a common critique of the food systems currently, such as our food system is broken, food system is dysfunctional, etc. So there is a quite common understanding about something is going wrong. However, how and what to transform is a question or a matter of controversy and a political vision. Transformation might be a functional and economic purposes or ethical transformation, respect for traditional food systems, or reliance on scientifically driven agribusinesses. It could serve different constituencies, some overlap but distinctly different. So it depends to whom you ask this question in relation to transformation. So it's a wide understanding for something for all of us.
Great, thank you. Chemuku, I'm going to ask you to go next.
Thank you. I think biodiversity stands at the center of food transformation, because for us to transform our food systems, we need to sustain a high level of biodiversity and take into account the orphaned crops and also those crops that are underutilized. And we need agroecological practices in place such that our resources are managed in an adaptive manner. And for us to transform the food systems, then we also need to protect our sacred and cultural lands, because this is likely to ensure that our natural resources are well managed, to promote circular farming, support soil and water conservation, and also have less use of chemicals which are bad for our environment, and also the traditional food systems that emit less carbon to the environment. So what I mean is that for us to transform the food system, then we need to have a system that sustain our ecosystem services, a system that is more resilient to climate change, and also a system that promote nutrition, not just only food security, because nutrition is key in addressing some of the problems, the health problems that we have. A good example is where incidences like of COVID-19 have been less registered in indigenous communities that rely on indigenous food system. To sum up this, a food system needs to be rooted in indigenous people's culture, identity, spirituality, and also solidarity, as this is very key in ensuring sustainability through intergenerational knowledge transfer. And the focus should be on food systems that do not destroy ecosystem, which are health and don't make people sick. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Very, very concise, but also I'm already picking up obviously the whole thing around biodiversity, sustainability, resilience, which is also another big theme and word that's being bandied about, and indigenous systems, which I'll follow up with you on it later. Raj, could I ask you to drop?
Thank you, Tim. It's hard to follow that. But I mean, if Hilal was talking about problematizing the word transformation, and Chimuku was encouraging us to think about food systems in a much more sort of biophysical and grounded indigenous way, I think the other element that's missing in terms of the food system is an understanding that the food system is not just a series of transactions that happens from farm to fork. That's normally what people think of. Oh, well, the food system is just farmers selling to supermarkets, selling to me, and that's the food system. But the food system is actually the series of operations of power that render those economic exchanges normal. It's the series of operations of power that encourage us to think of increased monopoly concentration in the food system as inevitable and as desirable. It's the series of operations of power that encourage us to think that the financialization of the food system is normal and fine, because after all, what could possibly be wrong with Bill Gates being the largest farmer in the United States, as he is at the moment, the largest owner of farmland? And it's the series of operations of power that encourage us to think that patriarchy, and particularly as it's been re-entrenched in the food system through COVID, and the exploitation of workers that's again been exacerbated, particularly migrant workers have been exacerbated through COVID, is normal and inevitable and can be only sort of tweaked around the edges. So it's important to think of the food system as a far more expansive series of operations of power than merely a series of economic transactions. And I think if we're interested in transformation, we need to be thinking much more about those operations of power.
Great, thank you. And again, I'm going to follow up with you on obviously the whole political economy of food, but it's also interesting, to talk about it in a much more system-wide manner, because a lot of the times we see, I think particularly when it comes to agriculture, we see it in terms of commodities and what's being traded and sold, and not necessarily around some of the slightly more difficult issues. Alan, can I?
Yeah, no, I mean, your question, what does food system transformation mean? And is it a buzzword? I mean, yes, it's a buzzword and it's been used widely, but it's also, frankly, an existential necessity. I mean, it's really not possible to imagine a world in 10 years' time where we're carrying on as we do now. Everything has to change if we're going to protect human health and if we're going to protect the planet. So the food system is extraordinary. It delivers food to 7 billion people, but it doesn't do that equally, and it doesn't do that without harm. And the harms that are currently being faced are, of course, as we've heard, insufficient food in parts, as you've said, Finn, insufficient diets and poor quality diets in parts of the world, and diets which are providing too much salt, fat and sugar So at one level, we're damaging the humans on the planet with this food system. And at another level, of course, this comes at an enormous environmental cost. So a transformation of the food system is absolutely essential for us to continue to exist on this planet so that we can protect human health and protect the planet. But it must also, and you've raised this, and I'll like to comment on this again later, this transformed food system must be prepared for the future. It must recognize what's coming down the line. It must recognize, in the way that we failed to recognize a looming pandemic and that it was bound to happen one day, it must recognize that projected climate change is going to change everything about the ability of the food system to deliver food for people, for a growing population. And a transformed food system must be a resilient food system that can cope with shocks and the changes that we know are coming to our environment. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And hopefully we can expand on quite a lot of those things later on. I'm now going to actually turn back to Hilal because I think in a way we almost sort of agree that, yep, we need to transform it. Again, it's the how. You know, what do we need to consider when we do this? Hilal, you're the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. Can you just tell us what is right to food and why it is important? I mean, it sounds self-explanatory, right? It's just 3 words, but I know that there are technical details behind this concept.
So you don't want to go to nitty-gritty legal issues, but it is very important because we need, as Raj and Alan and Chemical, how they explain the transformation. Right to food is an important part of this transformation because we need to deal with the power. We need to deal with the inequality. We need to deal with the gender issues and all kind of inequalities and injustices that we have been right now living in it, and mostly people that producing foods are the subject of this kind of human rights violation. So we really need the human rights perspective to look at the political economy and the politics of the food system without looking at the people that bringing us the food, which is 70–80% of the food comes from the local producers, comes from the people, or comes from the people that they subsistence farmers and workers. For instance, without the workers' rights, we cannot get any kind of cheap food, which now the system is trying to make it cheaper and more available. Actually, availability is not an important problem, but if we don't look at the legal perspective, we cannot see this little details. So what was it right to food is one of the oldest food rights in our Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. And after 1948, we have this covenant in 1966 that makes clear that this is a right, this is an entitlement and giving to people and also responsibility to state. So in the human rights system, there are 2 parties, that the right holders and the providers. But as you know, the food system is not only with these 2, and we have significant amount of private sector that comes into this important sector. So what happens? The government should really control the private sector while they are regulating to respect, to protect, and fulfill the human rights of the people. Just the people, not only citizens, but everyone. And also governments are responsible not only the national policies, but also internationally. If you look at, for instance, this very interesting article of 1966, it gives states very important responsibility. The right to food doesn't mean that the government, you sit at home, will provide like the charity type of system. The charity type of system is very dangerous, because when the big corporations or big time providers, we have to feed the world, it's a wrong thing, because feed can work itself, not someone else will feed you. It's a very important thing. We have to have a sovereignty of our decision-making process. What to eat, how to produce, and how to bring the market. So that's a more communal understanding that right to food brings to the food politics. Without this, we can make some maybe incredible kind of yields, which is going over the years very seriously increase, but comes with a very serious climatic and environmental pollution and problems, and living 1 billion people, almost 1 billion people cannot get food every day, and nutrition problem is even 2 billion. So something goes wrong if you don't look at the whole picture. We cannot look at only one picture. Let's put it this way.
Just very quick follow-up question, if you can answer very briefly. Why should the research community, working on health, nutrition, and agriculture, who are the people who are listening into this discussion, why should they consider right to food in their work?
Well, right to food is a kind of procedural system at the same time. If you want to monitor the system, just use the human rights principles. For instance, who makes the decision? Are you able to participate in the decision making? Is there any accountability? Is there any transparency? Is there an access to justice? How are we going to ask our governments that if they don't do their own obligation? So that's why I think scientific community should look at from the perspective of monitoring the food system going right or wrong.
Great, thanks so much, Hilal. I'm going to turn to Raj now because, Raj, you heard Hilal talk about the right to food, incorporating issues around power, inequality, and injustice, and that's very much linked to, this political economy of food that you're an expert on, and you talked about it briefly just now, answering the first question as well. But can you, briefly explain? Why is it, what's the whole political economy of food, and why is it important that we take this issue into consideration when we talk about food system transformation, or just food systems in general, and not just say things like yield, which is a key indicator of whether we can actually feed a growing population?
Well, thank you, Tin. I mean, here I am in Austin, Texas, in the United States on stolen land, and the United States has rather famously not signed up to the right to food, and that's partly because it's America, and global power dynamics make the U.S. Congress feel like it can and should do what it wants. But there are also other reasons why the US has signed on to some, has picked and chosen from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And quite a lot of that has to do with, again, the distributions of power. We'll get to this a little bit more later on, but to specifically answer the question around yield, and particularly with an eye to researchers who are listening, the problem with yield is that it is one of these dangerous indicators that is painfully simple to calculate, and therefore painfully attractive for researchers to track as an indicator of a range of other things for which it is a bad proxy. So, for example, let's just think about India, for example. There's a famous example of how over the course of 4 years, India doubled its grain production, its wheat production, at the end of the 1960s to the 1970s. And this is cast as an example of the kinds of food system transformation we need. And this was an example of the green revolution, of how a package of fertilizers and pesticides came in and improved Indian agriculture. And we need something like that for the 21st century. Now, the problem with that kind of a narrative that's supported by a range of operations of power that result in, for example, Norman Borlaug winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his work around increasing crop yields, is that you forget that a lot of the process of increasing grain output in India comes as a result of huge government subsidy. It comes as the result of excluding certain people from the land. It comes from a failure to do comprehensive land reform. It comes as, and you're able to certainly increase the amount of stuff coming out of the land, but only by draining the aquifers beneath the soil in Punjab, for example. And the long-term effects of that are the kinds of catastrophic failure of agriculture that we see now now in Punjab, where you've got farmers who are living in conditions of increasing soil salinity. You're seeing epidemic rates of farmer suicide and of drug abuse in rural communities in Punjab, and as a result, you're seeing vast amounts of protests, and the failure of agriculture in Punjab is an example of what has happened as a result of using this intensive agriculture that has denuded the soil, that has reduced biodiversity, and ultimately hasn't actually propelled India or even Punjab towards food security. If you look at the hungriest places on earth, you'll find India in the top tier, despite its emphasis and following of US policies around yield. So all of this is to say, look, there is a monomania around certain kinds of indicators that we see in the research community and that are funded and encouraged by the broader complex of the food system. Part of our job as researchers is to push back against these sort of single indicators and instead recognize the complexity of achieving the right to food and recognize the soil chemistry, the gender inequality, the conditions of tenure and biodiversity, all of which need to figure in a broader political ecology of the food system, because otherwise what we do is find ourselves in the trap of needing to use more pesticides, more fertilizers to increase more yield, and without any guarantee that the food actually goes into the stomachs of the hungry.
Thanks, Raj. Yeah, essentially, otherwise we just repeat the vicious cycle, right? Alan, I'm going to turn to you now, because obviously one of the things with this intensive agriculture and green revolution was also, right, using things like pesticide and fertilizers, which of course has environmental impacts. And you've been focusing on this nexus of food and environment. And, we've also seen lots of inputs, reports, sorry, not just in terms of pesticide and fertilizers, but also land use and how that impact on climate change. From your experience, though, how much do you think this is a priority for government leaders, considering personally, I see that as, a massive, big issue that should be taken at COP26. It should be out there, but it was only a few years ago that agriculture became part of the agenda in the climate negotiations.
No, I think you make a very good point there. I think there is a lot of interest in this space at the moment, but it's on one particular angle, which is the angle of mitigation. So how do we reduce the effect? How do we reduce the impacts of the food system on the environment? How do we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions? How do we reduce water use? Those sorts of things. And there's plenty of work there and plenty of interest, because that's, as Raj was just saying about yield, that's actually quite a simple metric. You measure carbon dioxide emissions and you can say, look how we're doing, well we're going to be net zero by, no one's going to be net zero ever, but imagining you could be net zero by 2050 and all of that, that's quite an easy thing to measure, and you can make some bold statements, and you can make, so our government here in the UK has made a very bold statement about reducing greenhouse gas emissions heroically by 2035, 68% reduction, or was it 78%? I mean, a massive reduction. The evidence that it's actually going to be able to deliver that is, of course, currently non-existent, but there is a large ambition. So those sorts of activities on mitigation, reducing the footprint of the farming sector, the food system in general, there's plenty of evidence there and efforts, especially in countries where the environmental footprint is large. So the UK being a very good example. What the UK also has done, though, is it has offshored its environmental footprints, and currently 60–70% of our fruit and vegetable in the UK, as an example, are imported from other countries. So the environmental footprints, the greenhouse gases, the water use, all of those come from are emitted in those countries, don't count in our carbon budgets. Thank you very much, aren't we clever? So there's plenty of effort there and work there. What there's much less of is an understanding. There's two things that I just want to say. One goes to Raj's point just then about the Punjab. So this is our team at the London School, funded by the Wellcome Trust, has done some fantastic work led by Francesca Harris, looking at the production of cereals in India and the use of water in India. for those cereals, and the way that, and shown really that, of course, as Raj just says, all of the cereals are being grown in the parts of the country now that are totally devoid of surface and surface water and aquifer water. And the resilience, the vulnerability of that system is extraordinary. So, real concerns about the vulnerability of this, but those longer term visions are quite hard to engage governments with. So we can work to reduce emissions, but actually if you think about the longer term impacts and what needs to be done, what those transformations need to be, and who needs to get engaged, there are much bigger questions that need to be asked there. So, so I think there, to answer your question directly, there's plenty of effort, especially in countries where emissions are high, to reduce emissions and to make lots of nice statements about, aren't we clever, we're reducing our emissions. And of course, the agriculture sector is working incredibly hard to do that, and we must note the efforts there. What's much less evident is efforts to secure a food supply for all people, a healthy supply of a healthy diet for all people at, at a price that everyone can afford, under what we know is coming, under projected climate change.
Thanks, Alan. You obviously just now talked about the fact that, the focus is on mitigation and there needs to be a bit more long-term plan. Is there anything else that you think is really crucial but's been missing from the debate so far? Very briefly, if you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. The one big thing, which is thinking, joined up thinking, frankly. It is so shocking that we still worry about whether folate does this to something, or whether this vitamin does this to something. It's so much more important that we think about where the food is coming from, what it's doing to the planet, and whether we'll be able to provide healthy diets in the future. So, under projected climate change. So that requires joined up thinking between all these disciplines and these silos, and a much higher level of question to answer, as I said earlier, really existential questions about our future.
Great, thank you, Alan. That's a very nice segue into Chimukwu, because you've been focusing on indigenous food systems, and it touches on a lot of some of the issues that all of the speakers have said in terms of sustainability, future proofing, equality, all those issues, and also just last week, the FAO, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and the CGI AI Research Center released a report with case studies and examples that showed how indigenous food systems are really sustainable. Can you explain a bit about this whole concept around biocultural heritage territories? I mean, what are they, Oh, Chimukwu, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay.
You're still on.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. I will first start by explaining what biocultural heritage concept mean. And this is usually a land use mosaic encompassing indigenous and traditional land tenure, production and exchange system, cultural identity, community organization, and the simultaneous goals of endogenous development and biodiversity conservation. Biocultural heritage territories usually arise from indigenous tradition of landscape management, and their main goal is holistic well-being rather than conservation, whereby holistic well-being means the well-being of both people and nature. And because of this, the outcomes of conservation are an autonomous process in these biocultural heritage territories. And they offer solution to most of the things that have been discussed, including enhancing community resilience and adaptation to climate change, and ensuring food security for these local communities. As Hilal indicated, we can't say that we will produce food to feed everyone, but through biocultural heritage territories, farmers can produce enough food to feed their household. A good example of a biocultural heritage territory in Kenya is the Kaya landscape, whose conservation strategies are based on Michikenda holistic well-being concept and customary laws that promote indigenous values of ecological stewardship, self-sufficiency, solidarity, and equity in terms of food production. This particular territory conserves over 60 crop varieties, which include indigenous vegetables that are about 21 varieties and wild fruits that total to about 25 varieties. And why are these territories important? The territories are very important because they use integrated landscape management approach that is usually community-led. And this offers a clear model for communities to adapt to climate change and pandemics, such as the COVID-19 that we are having now. The biocultural heritage territories are able to conserve agrobiodiversity. You recall gene banks can conserve many food crops, but cannot safeguard them all or protect the evolution, gene flow, and farmer selection and breeding practices that enhance genetic resources. This, in comparison to biocultural heritage territories, the territories create locally adapted habitats that are able to sustain more genetically diverse and resilient crop varieties that continuously adapt to climate change. And this is very key in addressing like SDG 2, and in the case of Kaya, where we have 60 crop varieties, diversification has enabled the communities to cope with climate change and also effects of COVID-19. The territories also promote cultural diversity, and culture and spiritual values drive communities to conserve crop diversity. Each culture, for example, has its own rich traditional knowledge for protecting and using biodiversity sustainably, which include many of the agroecological and climate smart farming practices, because culture drives agroecology and some of these climate smart practices that are resilient to the impact of climate change. The territories are also have the potential to address poverty and inequality. Modern development models usually perpetuate infinite growth and over-reliance on markets as a route to well-being. And as you may realize, poverty and inequality are better addressed through local ideas of social reciprocity and ecological equilibrium that support local food sovereignty, biological diversity, and also local economies, which are based on the cultural value of solidarity. Making reference to Kaya, for example, which is a biocultural heritage territory, ecotourism is rooted in the culture of the people, and this support local livelihoods, offering like alternative income and contributing to SDG 1.
Sorry, Chimuku, could I just ask you to sort of wrap up a little bit because we still have one more round. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll come back to you again, so hopefully you can talk a bit more. It's just that I'm slightly conscious of the time, because I do want to go for another very quick round of questions before opening up to the floor. And I'm going to start with Raj this time. Raj, you know, the title of today's discussion is Priority, Power, and Evidence. Do you think at this point in time, you know, power determines the other two, the priority and the evidence? If so, how can we change it?
Well, thank you, Tin. I mean, let me build on some of the ideas that Chimuku was talking about around agroecology. This is a term that may be unfamiliar, and insofar as you're able to derive it from its name, you might think, oh, that sounds a bit like using ecology in agriculture. So maybe it's something like, intercropping, where one of the famous intercropping systems is the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash, where corn is the cereal that everyone loves, and the beans are, provide protein, but also the roots are leguminous and they fix nitrogen. And then squash don't interfere with the roots of the other two, but they shade out weeds, and you attract beneficial insects, and you get squash at the end of the day. It's a rich cultivating system. And is that agroecology? No, that's just a way of combining three crops together in a particularly sensible way that indigenous communities in Mesoamerica have done for centuries. But agroecology goes beyond that, and I think this is what's at stake here. When we think of agroecology, we can't just think of clever intercropping systems, because then what happens is we're really just sort of taking certain kinds of information and knowledge out of indigenous communities and turning them into technologies that can be replicated elsewhere. And there's a great danger of that happening when 5% indigenous communities constitute 5% of the planet, but preserve 80% of the planet's biodiversity. And we could we're seeing just the most absurd things happening, where, for example, researchers are going into indigenous communities, literally scooping up poop, because indigenous communities' microbiome is much more diverse than us in the global north. And if researchers' job is just to turn shit into a commodity that then can be turned into pills that can then be transferred into people whose internal microbiome in the global north has been utterly denuded, then that's an example of the kinds of theft and prioritization of knowledge that that have characterized sort of colonial forms of knowledge in nutrition and health. But agroecology is not just about that. Agroecology is about the constellation of policies that allow knowledge to flow between different communities. It's the kinds of policies that have been absent from international agricultural and nutritional research and development, but which farmers in the front lines have taken to heart. So that's why we have a world where there are 8 million farmer groups looking at climate change and agroecology and biodiversity. This is research from Jules Pretty, led by Jules Pretty at the University of Swansea. No, not Swansea, Warwick. But Essex, bloody England, everything's so close together. But the point here is that when we think about, for example, the excellent paper that Alan's put in the chat, it ends with a call for diversifying production. Farmers in India are demanding transformations in the economic policy that make them do monoculture. And what we need is an understanding that agroecology is not just about what you plant, it's about the constellation of operations of power that make certain kinds of plantings inevitable and other kinds of plantings unthinkable. And I think that's why it's very important for us to think about the operations of power and knowledge, because farmers are definitely in the front lines of developing new kinds of knowledge. And the worst that could happen would be for governments and corporations to come in, privatize it, and then redistribute it along the kinds of models that we currently have and that are currently not fit for purpose.
Very quick follow-up. How can the research community help? Can they help bring about some change there?
Well, I mean, all of us in the research community, I think, need to commit a certain kind of class suicide. Often research careers are built on parasitism, on taking indigenous knowledge or taking knowledge from other kinds of places and presenting ourselves as experts who will bring light to the benighted. And what's very interesting working on the front lines of peasant movements is the vast amount of intellectual life that's happening in fields and around farms in ways that particularly value women's and indigenous knowledge that's been historically discounted by the research complex that we find ourselves in.
Great, thank you. Chimuku, I am coming back to you now. And linked to one of something Raj said just now as well about how research community sometimes perhaps ignore or does not include as much of the indigenous knowledge, and it may be sidelined as well in these big meetings. But you yourself believe that this is a panacea to some of the problems that farming is facing. Can you very briefly tell us why you think indigenous knowledge can help the world solve some of its food and farming issues? You need to unmute again. Let me.
Thank you again. And I wish to say that one of the greatest challenges to our farming communities presently is climate change. And traditional knowledge provides solution to issues that are related to climate change due to diversification of the different agrobiodiversity that local communities have, conservation of resilient wild relatives, which is also anchored on traditional knowledge. And for us to have traditional, good yields, then we also need traditional resilience strategies that maintain our ecosystems to continue providing the services. Moreover, we also need to link traditional knowledge and science to try and also enhance our productivity. A good example is when we have participatory plant breeding, where you get local knowledge from farmers and bring in science to improve productivity. I also want to say that traditional knowledge is important in minimizing greenhouse gas emission, because using traditional knowledge, farmers are able to grow their crops using the best agroecological and climate smart practices that are less harmful to the environment. Thank you.
Just a very quick follow-up. Do you have any message to the research community that's watching this discussion? Would you like them to have more research and evidence on the practices around indigenous communities? What would you like to say to them?
Yes, of course, yes. And the research should not only stop at the point of cultivating the crops, but it should go beyond to preservation, preparation, and also marketing. That is the only way we can promote these indigenous food crops, because the method of preparation, the method of preparation, preservation are quickly being eroded with modern science, and yet they are key in sustaining the whole value chain of indigenous food system. So I would really encourage this, and the research should be a participatory research that allows even the communities to actively participate in the research, help to generate knowledge and own the process. And this can be effectively done by empowering communities and having some of the members acting as researchers in any research project that is geared towards improving indigenous food systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Chimuku. That was very helpful. Ellen, before we go to the Q&A, I just have two quick questions to Ellen and Hilal. So one of the questions we received even before we had this panel discussion was linked to research and evidence that Chimuku was just now talking about. And the question asked, what kind of evidence, whether it's new or under prioritized, that are needed to guide decision-making in research and policy? What are your thoughts? And do you think it's because, do we need new evidence, or it's just that we're ignoring evidence that we don't like or that doesn't fit into our preconceived notions of what solutions should be?
Yeah, thank you. I think Chimuku's points just now were really important about local knowledge, and we're doing fantastic work with some extraordinary researchers in University of KwaZulu-Natal on neglected and underutilized crops. I mean, really, they're working with local communities. I have colleagues Tafadzwa Mahabadi, Rashida Davids, and Albert Modi, who are doing some really fantastic work with local communities to understand local production systems, local crop production systems, and really build on that extraordinary knowledge that's in the communities. Working been working for 20 years with these communities. It's a really extraordinary research. So that research is very important, but what's also really, so so I'm going to make 2 points. One, yes, we need more research, but two, we also need to deliver on what we've got. So on the more research question, I don't think we need many more global analyses, because they're interesting, but really, what do they tell national policymakers? What we need much more of is research which is focused at the national level, using national data and responding to national policy needs. And that is really critical. We're doing that in our chefs research, funded by the Wellcome Trust again. We've got some really working in the UK and India and South Africa, delivering research which is specific to those countries and responding to policy demands that are specific to those countries. That sort of research is really needed so that we can move, so we can support countries to respond. But what's also needed, and I think this is goes to your point, is delivery on some of the research we already have. So implementation of that. So if I tell you tomorrow, for example, I tell you now that there are clear benefits to your health, to population health, and to the environment of a predominantly plant-based diet. That's unequivocal. You know? But you try getting the UK public to change its diet, or you try getting the Brazilian public to change it's incredibly hard. So the evidence is there, the scientific evidence on impacts and effects is there, but actually the delivery, the social science, the behavior change, what we need is a whole of society shifts in behavior. So that's nudging, that's huge comms, that's massive policy, that's incentives, all of that needs to come together to deliver the changes we need. And so we don't need more research there. We need social science research to understand how best to do it so that we can learn and replicate. But it's a different form of research. We have sufficient evidence to know what we should do in many instances, but the question is how to get it done is a bigger question that still needs much thought.
Great, thank you. Yes, the how is becoming the very sticky issue on a lot of these things, right? Hilal, last question before we open to the floor. Do you think this, whole issue around right to food is being sufficiently addressed in the major summits that are coming up this year? And I'm not just talking about the Food System Summit, but the COP26 climate negotiations. There's also going to be the Biodiversity Convention, the COP15, and of course the nutrition event as well. Can you tell us, what are you feeling, whether that issue is being addressed, and if not, what should be done to make sure that that takes, center stage?
Before asking your question, actually, it's really relevant to when we talk about the scientists, what kind of scientists we are talking about. We shouldn't talk about only data collection, digitalization, using all kind of new technologies. Yes, science is extremely important, but what about the social sciences, what Ellen is saying? Many of the things that connected with our food system is connected with our social life, connected with our relationship with the soil, our relationship with the environment, and our relationship with the community. So from this, I am coming to this global summits. In global summits, unfortunately, there is a missing part about the social science, the importance of the social science, which is relevant also to the right to food and the human rights. So basically, when you go to this COP, because I used to be a part of the Turkish government COP UN climate change system, part of the negotiation team, and we had the difficulty to explain to member states what human rights is important for the climate change, because none of the participants are coming from human rights group. They were coming from environment, they were coming from energy, they were coming from different places, but important sociological and the human relationships are missing. It's not only FCC, but also all the other COPs that we really, because we talk about the sustainable development goals, right? Sustainable global SDGs are important, putting together everything, but still we cannot put together everything. It's not possible. So that's why I think right to food first was sort of forgotten by the Food Summit because it started more economistic view of the World Economic Forum connected with the Secretary General, and they bring their knowledge, their understanding, and their how to look at the food systems. And it was not the kind of biggest priority is right to food. But because of the criticism right now, the right to food in one way or another trying to be injected in the process. We don't know how effective it will be, but if it is not, I think the summit will not be properly explained to the world community. COP26, you know, climate change, Ellen knows a lot more than me. If you look at, food system cannot be touched by mitigation or adaptation, because food security is very important. We shouldn't touch the food systems or any kind of agricultural policy that because of the climate change should not be reduced people's food security. It's the wrong interpretation, finally understood, but still in the Paris agreement, they made the kind of preamble about human rights, women's rights, indigenous rights, but never right to food. Because it's important. When we put the right to food, there will be something that political economy is in trouble. So there is the problem about the right to food. Everywhere, not only FCC.
Yeah, no, thank you. Fascinating. I mean, we could just have the discussion forever, but we're going to open it to the floor. We've got quite a lot of Q&As coming in, so the trick's going to be trying to take as many as possible. And we have about 12 minutes to do this. I'm going to try and take like 3 at a time, also just so that we can take as many as possible. And if you could, again, you know, keep your answers succinct, that would be great. So let's take the first 3 questions. The first question is, how do you enforce food industries to stop what they are doing? You know, so essentially make sure that they also become interested in the kind of food system transformation that we are discussing today, that is sustainable, that's resilient, that also takes into issues, you know, that take into account issues around inequality and injustice. That's the first question. And it says it's directed to all, but maybe what I might do is ask perhaps Alan to take that and see if either Hilal or Chimuku want to do as well. And then there's another question. This one is directed to Raj directly. Says, how do you make policies and interventions that do take into account that issues that you have mentioned, you know, and that ranges everything from soil to land rights to, you know, to other issues, to, you know, and in a way to make these policies and interventions actually attractive to leaders in developing countries. Yeah, so quite specific. And the third one is, you know, can you discuss how food system transformation has affected nutrition and how to future-proof for this? So, you know, they're talking about how micronutrients have reduced over the years, and there's been research to show that that's been you know that's been observed. So how can this be adjusted? So 3 questions, and I'm going to ask Alan, if you can, to start off with, and then we'll go from there.
Brilliant. So I'll just quickly respond to that first question about the role of the food industry. So I think, you know, what we need to do is we need to recognize where there have been examples of change, number one. So we have seen, for example, and why. So for example, removal of trans fats, or reduction of sugar in products. Those are industry changes which have been brought about for various reasons, but they have demonstrated, industry has demonstrated an ability to change, and in some cases a willingness to change. And those sorts of things are more and more necessary. And I think we have a more and more engaged, some sections of the food system, I'm not saying all of it, not some section of the food industry, more and more engaged industry, which recognize its responsibility. The food industry, the industry also recognizes the impact it is having on the environment increasingly, but also that environmental change is forcing it to change its behavior. So we know that producers of some products, oranges, potatoes, whatever, are moving because they're no longer able to grow their products where they've traditionally grown them. And so they're responding, and they're aware, and they're thinking of strategies to maintain profits and to maintain production, but they are recognizing. And then the third thing, just quickly, is that they're also responding in different ways. So there are new markets for the food industry. For example, the alternatives to dairy and meat, which are burgeoning now on the market. Potentially they have some of them have a lower environmental footprint. We have no real idea of their health effects. A lot of them are highly processed. But there are these emerging emerging products on the market. So I think, you know, the industry is of course central to the problem and central to the solution. And I think we need to criticize them when they behave appallingly, which they sometimes do. But we also need to identify examples where they have responded and they are aware of their wrong and they've taken steps to respond.
Thank you, Ellen. Is there one other person who might want to take on the questions around the food industry? Hilal, would you? Or
Yeah, I think it's true. First of all, food industry is very heterogeneous. I mean, we are talking about what kind of food industry, which countries, and how big it is, how small it is. That's different. But basically, the role of the governments here, which regulators, they have to regulate the food industry. If they don't regulate the food industry, we only are relying on corporate social responsibility, which corporations right now is supporting this idea. Only few of them maybe will be a kind of seller industry, or some of them just a greenwashing or some kind of not really a perfect performance are dealing with, but only kind of advertisement of their own trend. So the responsibility is important, and responsibility also extraterritoriality responsibility is important, because many of the big industry, they are operating all over the world, especially in the developing countries. If the developing countries are not able to regulate them or make them responsible, then the home country should really take into this role to limit this kind of all kind of violations. So it's a legal issues important is going on right now. We don't know how it will go further.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of both carrot and sticks to use. Raj, do you want to take the one on the policy interventions that take into account the second question?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and I think that this links to the corporation question. I am less optimistic than I think perhaps Alan is about the possibilities of corporate change. You know, we just heard about how Nestle, the world's largest food corporation, had in a leaked internal memo an admission that 70% of its food products are unhealthy, and 98% of its beverages, excluding coffee, are unhealthy. Now, this links because this is really a question about your theory of change, because these corporations are friendly with governments and do. You know, I mean, it's not a secret to observe that there's quite a lot of lobbying between the grocery manufacturers associations across the world and agriculture departments of agriculture. In order to make certain kinds of policies attractive, politicians really do need to have their feet held to the fire. Historically, what has done that is organizing from below, union movements, for example, and peasant movements. And one of the reasons why there was a Green Revolution is because there were quite so many very successful peasant movements demanding things like land reform. So I worry that the sort of rise of authoritarianism that we've seen under COVID has been so successful that the kinds of social mobilization we need in order to be able to hold governments and corporations' feet to the fire is less likely now. But historically, that has been the only way in which durable change, as opposed to the sort of corporate social responsibility sort of long pat on the back process for corporations, has ever really achieved lasting change. So I'm afraid that I don't have a whole lot of optimism here, because I think that organizing from the streets really is the only demonstration, the only sort of demonstrable way forward that we've seen that's been robust. And although we see interesting moments in Colombia, for example, at the moment, certain moments in Brazil and certain other parts of the world, in general, I'm not terribly optimistic about the possibilities of this theory of change. And the kicker here is, for everyone in the seminar, is to sort of have a think about, well, what is your theory of change?
Great, thank you, Raj. Alan, I might have to come back to you again for this question. What are some of the unforeseen or unintended consequences as a result of, interventions? And can you talk about it? Like, for example, what if we try to make the farming and agriculture systems much more climate friendly, but perhaps that has an impact on nutrition, for example, the potential impacts of biofortified crops that perhaps are being encouraged. Have we thought about what could be the other consequences?
So I'm slightly struggling with the question. I mean, the responses to climate change. I mean, there is, of course, this evidence that increasing carbon dioxide levels in the air reduce the nutrient content of some crops, cereals especially, but others possibly as well. That's a constant, because the crop grows more, so the concentration of the nutrient declines. There's that evidence. And of course, there are some responses such as you say, biofortification and others that are increasing and very important, I should add. Very, very clever technology. But beyond that, maybe others on the panel have a better grasp. I don't really understand the question, then I'm sorry. Could you?
Yeah, it was about discussing whether, transformation of food systems, whether have they affected nutrition and how to future-proof for this. If nobody wants to take it, we can move on. We have a lot of questions, actually.
well, I suppose I would just say, if food systems are going to transform, they need to transform in a way that produces healthy diets and doesn't produce, mass sort of monoculture of cereals which don't have the nutrient needs, that don't meet the nutrient requirements of population.
Yeah, so it can't come at the expense of nutrition. Exactly, right. Two more questions, and I'm going to sort of blend them together because I think it's quite interesting. And I think for this, the first one, I'd like Chimuku and Hilal to take on very briefly, if you can. So the whole interdisciplinary sort of thing around the food systems and the terminologies, right? On the one hand, there's a lot of people that are proposing solutions that seems to be technocratic, but things like right to food and food justice looks to be on the opposite end. They both seem to be at the opposite end of each other. How do you see these concepts joined together? Can they? So that's Hilal and Chimuku, if you can take that. And another one, perhaps just for the interest of time, I'll ask Raj and Alan to do it. It says, do you think the term food system is actually helpful? Is this universally known or understood term with a universal definition? So Hilal and Chimuku, who wants to go first in terms of the poles opposite between the technological solution and the right to food and food justice?
So you want me to go first? Yeah, this is an important kind of juxtaposition. Can we do it from the human rights perspective, or can we do it basically political economy or capitalism, free market system? If you talk about the water, for instance, you can privatize the water, or you can make the water to human rights. It's all kind of natural resource oriented oriented areas. You need to have this kind of dual understanding. In ideal world, it shouldn't be dual. It has to be together, which means it could be a kind of economistic view, but limiting the violations because human rights are there. So right to food should not be violated in favor of the economistic view. This is the ideal world. Can we reach it? Maybe. or we have to do it at some point because the human rights violations also violate the environment and violate our ecosystem. So that could be in the future, but this duality is everywhere. It's not only in food systems.
Great. Chimuku, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I want to add something. I think the emphasis here should be on the right of communities to access quality food that addresses the nutritional needs of the communities, rather than focusing on business model that promote food like a business commodity that can only be accessed for those who have the muscle, the economic muscle. Then secondly, regarding technology and right to food, we need to have a balance, to strike a balance. Let us allow local communities to also contribute their local knowledge, which can be integrated with the technology without compromising also the quality of food and also access to that quality food. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I think what, if I could just add my own 2 cents, when I was talking to somebody, I think Sustain from the UK, which is a network of farming organizations, and they were saying, look, we're not against, and they're really pushing on agroecology, and they're saying we're not against technology. We like technological solutions. We're not mutually exclusive. We just want to make sure that the kind of technological solutions that are available are applicable everywhere at every level, and not just to a select few. So I think that's probably worth emphasizing that as well. Alan, Raj, very briefly, should we be using the term food system? Is it helpful?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, super quickly. I think it's useful to qualify it with capitalist. I do think that it's important to understand what kind of food system this is, and that there might be other ones. But I don't see an alternative. I mean, otherwise we talk about the food chain, which is far too narrow, or the supply chain, or about sort of pipelines of one kind or another, and it's complicated. And I don't think we should apologize for introducing complexity into something that's been simplified in order to keep power the way that it is.
Yeah, I would agree entirely with Raj. I think there is a benefit from having the word system there, actually, because it recognizes that it's not a simple chain, it's not a silo, but it's a complicated system. And without that, we make this stuff far too simple, and that's what we've been doing for far too long. And I think that's the benefit. But I would agree, and Kate's put a question in the comments there as well. Thanks for that, Kate. I mean, what we don't have is a particularly good understanding of it, but some of these things take some time to develop.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Alan. I see that you have been answering some of the questions in the Q&A as well, so thank you. We are supposed to be ending our session now, but I'm going to take one more question just because it's going lively, and our speakers have been excellent. And I think this is quite important. This is essentially about 4 questions all rolled into one, and this is a great one to end on, just because it touches on the whole theme of today's discussion on power and tensions and agendas. And I think one of the sub questions around it is not necessarily just big agribusinesses, but local SMEs, and whether any of you have any suggestions in terms of their role and how to get them on board the kind of transformation that we're talking about, changing the sort of like the decision making, a current sort of hierarchy, and whether you have any other thoughts around dealing with some of these tensions around the power and priorities. Who wants to start?
Okay,
Hilal, go ahead.
I'll do. Okay. Actually, the COVID-19 is a great way to teach us what was going wrong in our food system. So very sophisticated global value chains kind of broke, and we understood that it is not resilient enough. But the local communities, local agriculture, and going back to your backyard for neighbors, and making national food system much more resilient and self-sufficient, which self-sufficiency is not really a nice word for the FAO, because FAO doesn't like the countries go to the self-sufficiency, because self-sufficiency is impossible. True, but it is important to make the food system making more local, more dealing with the national level, and making smaller kind of a shorter value chain than the global big time conglomerate food system. That's my answer.
Great. Raj, do you want to go next?
Very, very briefly, I mean, I think, look, without romanticizing SMEs, because it's possible for them to be exploitative too, I do know that, you know, many of the SMEs that I get to work with are not pleased at having to pay workers so badly, or, you know, being able to take shortcuts in order to meet the bottom line at a cost of the environment. But you know, the fact remains that they find themselves trapped by policies that make it the only way in order to be able to break even. On the bright side, there's nothing quite as frustrating for everyone as the power of a good example. And there are lots of good examples of corporations that have you know, and of movements in particular that have managed to circumvent some of these, you know, some of these sort of dead ends in the food system. And I would just encourage folks to look at some of the ideas coming out of Latin America in particular, where food movements are doing some terrific things around figuring out how to work with governments, for example, to get good, healthy food in schools. There are ways in which governments and small businesses can work together for win-win solutions for people and planet, but they tend to break the market model, and that's what needs to happen.
Chimuku, Alan, I'm going to come to you last. Any thoughts? Last thoughts? Final thoughts? You need to unmute.
Food security should be addressed like locally. We need to have like local solution for food security for local communities. And as Hilal said, this has been evident during the COVID-19 pandemic, where there have been many lockdowns and the movement of food from one area to others became difficult. But if we had strong community groups, SMEs engaged in food production at local level, this could have helped to meet the needs of the communities at that particular level. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
I mean, I don't really have much to add here. I think just, you know, what's clear, we need to find some solutions. We need to build on those positive examples that Raj identified. You know, we need to, I mean, you know, just to go back to what I said at the beginning, this is an existential problem, and we need to think out of the box. We need to move out of comfort zones. We need to engage with more people than we ever have before in order to find solutions.
Great, thank you so much. You know, it's been such a rich and fascinating discussion that touched on so many, you know, aspects, and some of them are very long-standing as well. Yeah, these are not new issues around access to food and nutrition. And I guess if I could just reiterate just some very briefly some points. I think Alan's already said that just now. You know, we do need food systems transformation because it is an existential necessity. We cannot not have it. And of course, when doing that, we have to make sure that we have to remember that whole, you know, it all starts from everybody having the right to food, and everybody just means if you are a human being, that you are included. You don't have to be a citizen anywhere, you know, and it is also so crucial to remember that the whole food systems that we're talking about is not just a series of economic transactions. There's a lot of power play embedded within lots of different chains and strands within the system that we need to take into consideration as well when we think about transforming it. It is going to be complex, it is going to be messy, and you know, but it is necessary. And I think the particular, appeals I heard today was, you know, that the fact that we need a lot more, you know, social science research, behavioral change research, and also research on indigenous food systems, because there are such rich knowledge embedded within them, and they need to be not just about cultivation, but also, like Chamuku said, preparation, preservation and marketing. And perhaps from there, we can already find some solutions that may be part of how we can transform our food systems. Thank you so much to our speakers. Can we all give them a virtual round of applause for all of their insights? And thank you to the audience for staying, 7 minutes longer than we were supposed to. And it's been an absolute pleasure chairing this discussion. All the best for the rest of the week, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great.